Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a really big question. Is happiness literally coded into our DNA? And could that genetic blueprint help explain why some entire countries seem to be happier than others?
All right, so let's get right into it. We all kind of know that stuff like a country's wealth, its political stability, and its culture play a huge role in national happiness. But what if there's something deeper going on, something biological? Could a population's genetic makeup actually predispose it to being more or less happy? So our investigation kicks off with a prime suspect, a specific gene that neuroscientists have connected to serotonin, which you probably know as one of the brain's main feel-good chemicals. Okay, so this gene has a bit of a mouthful of a name, 5-HTTLPR, but all you really need to know is that it comes in two main flavors, or what scientists call alleles, a long version and a short version. And for a long time, studies looking at individuals have found this really compelling link. The long one seems to be connected to higher life satisfaction, while the short one has been tied to things like depression and anxiety. So just how big of a deal is this link? Well, check this out. One major study in the US found that people who had two copies of the long allele were a full 17 percentage points more likely to say they were very satisfied with their lives. That's compared to people with two copies of the short one. Seems like a pretty open and shut case, right? So, you think the case is closed. The evidence seems pretty solid at the individual level. But this is where our investigation hits a major snag. What happens when we stop looking at individuals and zoom out to look at the genetics of entire countries? And here's the massive puzzle. The theory that works so well for one person just completely breaks down when you look at entire countries. I mean, if the short allele makes people less happy, then the countries with the most people carrying it should be the saddest places on Earth. But they're not. In fact, when you run the numbers, there's basically no connection. Take a look at East Asian countries like China, Japan, and Korea. They have some of the highest rates of this supposedly unhappy short allele in the world, but their national happiness scores? They're pretty much right in the middle of the pack globally. This is a huge contradiction, and it means our first suspect is definitely not the whole story. Okay, so with our first lead hitting a dead end, researchers had to look for another suspect in our genetic code. And what they found, well, it points to a totally different and way more powerful explanation for why some nations are happier. Now, this is where things get really interesting. When we swap out our first suspect for a different gene variant, this COMT158 MET allele, bam, look at this. It has a correlation of 0.49 with life satisfaction. That might not sound huge, but in this kind of research, that's a really strong link. And you can see it's highly statistically significant, which basically means it's not just a fluke. Our first suspect had nothing. This one is a real clue. But here's the really cool part. What is this new gene even for? It turns out the COMT gene isn't just about your personal mood. It's connected to what we call pro-social behaviors. Things like empathy, being cooperative, and tolerance. It's about how we get along with each other. And this is the key to the whole thing. The more of this gene a population has, the more you see these real-world signs of a tolerant society. Countries with a higher frequency of this allele tend to have better gender equality, stronger legal protections for minorities, more openness to foreigners, and cultural values that really emphasize self-expression. Okay, but that just opens up another mystery, right? Why would a gene tied to tolerance be more common in some places than others? Well, to answer that, we have to go way, way back into our deep evolutionary past. So here's the theory, and it's pretty wild. In parts of the world where there was a historically high threat from diseases and parasites, avoiding strangers wasn't just rude, it was a literal survival strategy. This created evolutionary pressure that favored genes linked to being wary of outsiders. But in safer regions with fewer diseases, the cost of interacting with strangers was much lower, which allowed these more open, pro-social, and cooperative genes to spread. And you might be thinking, okay, that's a neat story, but is there any proof? Well, how about this number, -0.71? That is the statistical correlation between the historical prevalence of parasites in a region and the frequency of that pro-social COMT gene today. A correlation that strong is almost unheard of in this kind of research. It's a massive clue. So what does that mean? It means the higher the threat from disease was historically, the lower the frequency of this tolerance gene is in that population today. This deep history might actually explain almost half of the reason this gene is spread across the globe the way it is. It's like a faint echo from our ancestors' environment. So, where does this leave us? We've got genes, we've got deep history, but here's the thing, they aren't destiny. They're just some of the ingredients in the much more complicated recipe for what makes a nation happy. Because when you throw everything into the pot, genetics, economics, culture, and ask a computer what actually predicts happiness the most, the genes don't even make the top three. The biggest pieces of the pie are social tolerance, a society that values self-expression, and, you guessed it, having a stable, trustworthy government. All right, so let's wrap this all up. The big takeaway here is that there's no single happiness gene. It's way more complicated. It seems a gene like COMT can predispose a population towards the behaviors that build a more tolerant and therefore happier society. And maybe that predisposition was shaped by ancient history. But ultimately, it's the society we build today, our culture, our politics, our sense of security that really drives our collective well-being. And that really leaves us with a powerful final thought, doesn't it? Our genes might nudge us in one direction or another, but they don't decide our fate. This research suggests that the real path to a happier world isn't found by decoding our DNA, but by actively choosing to build societies that value tolerance, security, and freedom for everyone.